Welcome to the Caffeine stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine stream. My name is CB Robertson, and this is episode 34. A particular thank you and shout out to Jonathan Maggio, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who reminded me that it has been a minute since I have recorded one of these. And I've been meaning to get around to these. Things keep popping up, but that's not a very good excuse. But I had put out an Instagram poll a while back on what other contemporary thinkers and philosophers should I mention something about, someone who I know a little bit about. And the winner of that poll was Bronze Age Pervert, the pseudonymous author of the Twitter published bestseller, I believe I can say, Bronze Age Mindset. Not that anyone who follows New York Times bestseller lists would know, because this book and this author sort of circumvent that whole program in a very interesting way, which is one of the interesting things about him. So I thought I'd take a little bit and talk about it. The first thing of interest is, of course, the author's name, Bronze Age Pervert. What's up with that? I have a little bit of hesitancy, not a complete unwillingness. I'm not by no means allergic to anonymous authors and writers, but I think it's healthy to have a degree of suspicion around, anonymous writers. You never know who is, not just who is writing this, obviously, but for what purpose and what the angle is. There is some value in understanding who is doing this writing and what their background is. Sort of to dovetail back with the old, post-physique episode from last year and the importance of ethos. So one of the reasons I'm willing to do this podcast on Bronze Age Pervert is that we actually have a fairly good idea of who Bronze Age Pervert is. There's, I think, 95 to 99% certainty that Bronze Age Pervert is one Costin Alamiriu. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. He is a Romanian, I'm sure he'd like the title Roman, PhD candidate in political history of some variety. And he is unbelievably knowledgeable in the classics. I listened to one of his podcasts, which is called Caribbean Rhythms. You can subscribe to it on Gumroad, on the Iliad. And he was able to read off not just, dozens of lines of Greek in ancient Greek, but reading them excellently, like really well. I can recite the first 7 lines of the Iliad from memory in Greek, but it's not a particularly good reading. If you listen to my reading, Meinin aide thea peleadio Achilleos olumenein, and you go and listen to his reading of it, his reading is much better, objectively. And he's got hundreds of lines of that memorized, which, there is a sense in which that can be viewed as just, it's kind of a classics trick. But his analysis of the Iliad demonstrates a depth and understanding when he talks about the meaning of menace, which you see a little bit in his book as well, although not directly. I am maybe 70% sure that he's read Leonard Molnar's book on the word. If he hasn't, he's at least come across some of that commentary indirectly, or even more impressively, came to that conclusion on his own. In either case, you can learn a lot about the classics from his understanding. Now, that doesn't mean that he isn't coming at these things with a bit of an angle. This sort of thing should be a natural skepticism should be held and maintained when dealing with a pseudonymous author, in my opinion. That said, I don't think he got anything significantly wrong in his analysis of the Iliad, except perhaps in his dismissal of the importance of the soul. And this dismissal is, I think, part, personal aesthetics and his philosophy of vitalism, which we will get to in a little bit. But it also comes to this word chittering, and I'll take a moment to digress for a second on and nerd out on classics stuff. He says he quotes the Iliad describing the soul departing the body and chittering away as if it's something inconsequential and kind of sad and pathetic to watch. And pathetic is, I think, would be a correct descriptor, but many Homeric verses, the words chosen are selected in order to fit a particular meter, and they're not chosen for their particular precise insinuations. So I think he might be reading a little bit too much into that. And the whole project of Homeric immortalization concerns the soul, I think. So I would have a scholarly disagreement with him on that, but his position is, I think, eminently respectable. Even in that point. And I can't recommend his podcast on the Iliad highly enough. But that tangent aside, it's important to know who this is because with our knowledge that Costin Alamiriu is Bronze Age Pervert, and my source on this is a couple of people within academia. In that world, I guess this is something of an open secret. We can look at one particular altercation, and I'll play a little bit of it here, where Costin gets into an argument with Bill Kristol, of all people, the famous neoconservative, and it's an incredibly amusing back and forth. I'll only play Costin's question. Bill Kristol's response gets progressively less impressive the more he's pressed on the matter, but I'll play that for you here.
Yes, I noticed that you asked about the question, to which Trump is the answer, and what the problem was and why people are dissatisfied. There were people, I would have to say, unlike probably most of you, who predicted Trump's win maybe a year in advance, including Ann Coulter and Steve Saylor and many others, and who knew that the animating question was mass immigration, in particular mass third world immigration. And I'm curious about why you missed this question that is so important, not just in the United States, but in Germany and parts of Europe with Merkel and so on. I don't know about you, Galston, but I remember Crystal, you quite recently called people who wanted quite a mild immigration restriction reform, you called them know-nothings. And I wonder why the people who did predict that Trump or somebody like Trump would win base this on the view that mass immigration, mass third world immigration was the animating issue of our time, and why you missed that, whether it's because of your worldview in general or contempt for the white working class or other issues.
All right, so that is his real voice, not the exaggerated Russian, maybe slightly Greek, strange voice you'll hear in Caribbean rhythms, which is a pretense much like his writing. But what we can know from this interaction is that what is advanced in Bronze Age Mindset is not purely some op. It's not some manipulation to try to do something to you from someone who is disingenuous. Now, I think it is a manipulation, and we'll get into that in a minute, but not a disingenuous manipulation, if that makes sense. So let's get into Bronze Age Mindset, the big book by Costin, aka Bronze Age Pervert. What is this all about? I think there are really two significant and interesting features of Bronze Age mindset. First of all, there's the content itself. As a book, there might be no better introduction to Nietzschean philosophy than Bronze Age Mindset. I would feel comfortable calling it an introduction. Much of his writing it's not quite plagiarism, because he does put it in his own words, and he does mention Nietzsche. But it's anyone who has read, more than 2 books by Nietzsche, much of Bronze Age Mindset will feel very, very familiar, will feel very at home. But he does offer some unique and interesting perspectives of his own. I think the one that comes first and is in many ways the most interesting is his critique of Darwinian evolution. And this dovetails into his view of what life is, which is the Nietzschean part. But the critique of Darwinian evolution, I think, is original. And he says Darwinian evolution is not wrong exactly. I mean, selective pressures do cause, changes in species as adaptive mutations reproduce at higher rates than maladaptive adaptations, and you get a progress of change over time in the nature of species. But what he says is that Darwinian evolution is only correct in certain contexts, and those are contexts of life under duress. And he says this is actually an extremely incomplete, and in fact not even a particularly defining conception of what life is. Life is not just life under distress. Life is not just existence under selective pressures. There's this whole other dimension of life that is where things are going correctly. And there's a slip that biologists and Darwinists will often use, that he points out, where they'll say that there is no meaning or purpose in life. They try to avoid that, but they will slip into saying that survival and reproduction is the meaning and purpose of life, because their Darwinian notion of how life transforms and continues over time just casually slips in their mind into some kind of purpose. And he says, no, the purpose of life is the feeling of your own power expanding. And the metaphor he gives, this beautiful metaphor that he describes going for a hike, and he is at this waterfall, and he sees these birds that nest in the cliff next to the waterfall, and at certain times of day, at certain times of year, the birds will go just absolutely nuts and will start dive bombing and doing all kinds of aerial acrobatics through the waterfall and around it, just glorying in their own power of flight, as he describes it. This might be a little bit of projection, but you can but he asks, what's the purpose to survival and reproduction of this maneuver? It's not a mating routine. It's not the right time of year or whatever. It's obviously not very, protective. There's a degree of risk to that kind of thing. It's an excessive use of energy and calories with no benefit to the organism in a kind of calorie economy of survival. He says this is actually the essence of life, and survival and reproduction are byproducts of this vital energy that life possesses. So he's saying Darwin isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. and this incompleteness shows an incomplete understanding of what life is. Oh, and so we can obviously see, the influence of Nietzsche, but with some interesting theory being built on that. And much of the rest of the book is really implications drawn from this understanding of the nature of life and the essence of life. So for young men, he talks about the importance of uncontrolled space. Suburbs are the worst. Suburbs are the worst because in a suburb, there is no uncontrolled space. Uncontrolled space is necessary in Bronze Age Pervert's view for young men to develop their own inborn capacities and powers. That's how they discover themselves is the wrong phrase, because it implies finding something that wasn't already there. It allows them to grow fully, as opposed to growing something like a plant that's in a small pot that holds all the roots in, and it can't grow to its full height because it's contained. So that's antithetical to the true nature of life and the desires of life. And he's quite vivid in his descriptions of animals caged in zoos, and how this is the worst possible fate that can happen to an animal that has this vital spirit. And I think that's another important point, and maybe the most contentious view advocated in the book. The sort of point of action is, he seems to imply that young men should join the military in order to acquire militaristic skills and aspire to be pirates. They should be out in the sun lifting, and consider perhaps moving to third world countries where they might, take over and expand in truly uncontrolled spaces, and further not just life, but the life of particular groups of people. There is, as we heard before, he's particularly concerned about white people and the white race. I can't say this for certain. I'm fairly convinced, though, that Costin is a white nationalist, and that part of the manipulation of Bronze Age mindset is to move people, young white men, in the direction of white nationalism. So be on the lookout for that. But aside from the content, which is interesting, and I do think there is room for critique of his view of the nature of life. I wrote something about it a while back, which I think it's interesting, but his view of the nature of life is, I think, also incomplete. That glorying in one's own power, can be viewed as, also that's a point, that's a point on the graph of life, but it's not the whole thing either. And there are other kinds of enjoyment in life, besides either survival and reproduction, or this Nietzschean power philosophy. And I would offer from Homer specifically, and Homer's Odyssey. People familiar with the classics might correctly guess that Costin prefers the Iliad to the Odyssey. That there might be something to say about life in connection, in noos, that we see with Odysseus and Penelope, and with his son Telemachus, and with his homeland. And that's, I don't see that connection accounted for in the way that this will to power is. So there might be room for the development of a counterpoint there. But anyways, I think the content is in some ways not even the most philosophically interesting thing about Bronze Age Pervert and his book. I think it's hard to appreciate this book without appreciating the style, the writing style, even apart from the content. Now, in writing, the style is supposed to match the subject matter. It's what Martin Amis calls good. What was the word? Good form. He said no writer gives a damn about what's polite and not hurting feelings, but good etiquette. I think etiquette was his word. Was congruence between the sound of the writing and the style and the subject matter being written about. So I guess we haven't totally escaped the subject matter, but in focusing on the style, Bronze Age Mindset is a masterclass in stylistic pretense, in matching the style to the subject matter and executing it just flawlessly, in my opinion. Now, there is some subjectivity in, what we might view matches what as far as matching style to content. Should a if you're having romantic feelings, is a sonnet more appropriate than a haiku? There's some subjective opinion on there, and it'll come down to familiarity with your audience. But the audience that he is writing for is established, and Costin states this actually in the early parts of the book. He says he is speaking to frogs that he knows on the internet. Now, frogs, I believe, is a reference to the Pepe meme, which is, familiar, particularly on 4chan. And in many ways, there is a kind of internet style that has emerged out of 4chan. We see this with, green text posts and other meme artists on social media. There's this kind of blend of very simple speech, very simple syntax, but also sometimes very highly elevated vocabulary. And this is also usually mixed with very iconoclastic vulgarity and a kind of self-conscious postmodern humor mixed in as well, and all combined in an anecdotal storytelling mode. Most green text posts on 4chan are personal anecdotes or ideas written in the style of personal anecdotes. You can never know because anonymity is kind of a part of the mode. It's kind of a part of the genre. And we see this with one of the other great masters of this internet genre of writing. I'm speaking of Chateau Artiste, aka Royce in DC. I forget his real name. When I first read Bronze Age Mindset, I thought it was Chateau Artiste who had written it. Turns out not to be the case. And we see this with some other, Twitter authors. Delicious Tacos, another, pseudonymous author, self-published, that does quite well for themselves. I think Harassment Architecture, someone Ma, is another example. Another pseudonym. That pseudonym sounds like a real name, is not. But there's this similarity in style, and this is both the target audience of Bronze Age Pervert, but it's Bronze Age Mindset is also, I think we can say, kind of a pinnacle of and tour de force of this genre. It is, in his own way, glorying in his own power of writing to his audience that appreciates and understands this style. And so once you've developed an appreciation for the frogs and their, anonymous posts, his anonymity becomes a part of the genre as well. So I hope I'm not ruining that for anyone. He's been out for a little while, so I hope it's had its effect, I think. And for the rest of us who have appreciation for other styles, understanding the author is important for other reasons. So I think that there is good stuff in the philosophy of Bronze Age Mindset. There's also bad stuff, and I think he's definitely pushing for a particular political end. And when you listen to, I haven't listened to all of Caribbean Rhythms. I'm sure many people who listen to this will have listened to more than I have. But it sounds like he is advocating for a kind of, pan-Western white ethno-state, which is, not happening for a variety of reasons. B, in my opinion, not a good idea for an equally broad number of reasons. But you can see at least and appreciate the consistency of that view and that aspiration with the vitalist view of life that he espouses. So he is at least arguing from first principles. And one of the things you can do in philosophy is work from the conclusions backward and say, well, if the conclusion of this foundational view is clearly bad or wrong for X number of reasons, perhaps the initial premises are wrong too. This is called a reductio ad absurdum, of course. I don't think his view is absurd. I think it's just wrong. But it is nonetheless interesting. And I think people really miss out when they moralize about positions that they disagree with and say, well, that's wrong. That's like evil and clearly morally wrong. There's a lot to be learned by putting that initial feeling to the side and saying, okay, these people are arguing for this interesting position. Why do I disagree with this? As Christopher Hitchens famously said, how do I know the earth is round? Am I sure about the theory of evolution? I know it's supposed to be true. Here's someone who said there's no such thing. It's all intelligent design. How sure am I of my own views? That kind of questioning is important, not just for philosophy, but in being able to think on your own too. And I have to thank Costin for his style in here, because there are moments in Bronze Age Mindset where he throws in things that are so ridiculous that they seem designed to jar us out of our laziness. They seem designed to jar us out of our ruts in our thought. At one point, he dismisses the idea of Antarctica. He says, "I don't believe it exists." But it's said so casually. There's no argument made. It's just an aside. Like, oh yeah, of course, there's no good evidence Antarctica exists, and it moves on. And it's so jarring that whether or not you accept his position or not, it still sort of jumpstarts your critical thinking. Because if you believed everything else he said to that point, surely you won't follow him unthinkingly into that, although you might entertain it. That jumpstart might cause you to entertain things you might otherwise not have. And that's not always a bad thing to do. So this is an extremely valuable book. This is one of the books that, historians, 70, 80 years from now will look back on and talk about, oh yeah, the late 20-teens, the early 2020s saw such, political upheaval. There was rise in different kinds of, romantic thought, revivals in Nietzschean philosophy, and this book might be mentioned, I think. Not as an example of philosophy, because again, Nietzsche is really the bedrock of this, and I don't think Nietzsche would have agreed with the ethno-nationalist view of Costin. but as a work of history, and also perhaps as a work of literary significance. This is really good writing, and I think people who dismiss the book on moral grounds, which might be valid, or philosophical grounds, which can be valid, nevertheless might be missing out on some of the stylistic value of this book and an appreciation for good writing once you understand the genre. So if you aren't familiar with Bronze Age Mindset, I hope I've convinced you to consider taking a look at it. If you're a fan of Bronze Age Mindset, I hope I haven't offended you too much. But in any case, I think it is an interesting and significant book, and I would encourage everyone to check it out, if only to satiate your curiosity and to be willing to dip your foot in a different frog's pond, so to speak. So, hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you all later.